Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meier. I'm the Dean of the Russ College of Engineering and Technology. I'm excited to welcome you to this Stalker's lecture celebrating the National Academy of Engineers Russ Prize and featuring Dr. Paul Yock, one of the 2019 recipients. The NAE and the Ohio University recognized Dr. Yock and 4 others early last year for innovations in coronary angioplasty, enabling minimum invasive treatment of heart disease. We have been lucky to host 3 of the other recipients last fall. And with other recipients, Dr. Schwartz, and coming on Thursday this week. So in case today is your first Russ lecture series, and the Russ Prize is currently the top bioengineering prize in the world, which is comparable to the Nobel Prize. You may not know this, but there is no Nobel Prize for engineering. Russ College alumnus Fritz Russ, who was an innovator in biomedical engineering himself, and his wife, Doris, established the Russ Prize with a gift to Ohio University. So their goal was to recognize achievements that improve the human conditions. Awarded every other year since 2001, the prize has honored accomplishments including kidney dialysis, the automated DNA sequencer, and the technology behind the LASIK surgery and the cochlear implant. We are very proud to celebrate the engineers, scientists, and the physicians who we call creators for good behind these technologies. They have saved and improved millions of lives. So now I'm happy to introduce our guest today. So Dr. Yock is Meier Weiland Professor of Medicine and the founding co-chair of Stanford's Department of Bioengineering, with courtesy appointment in the Graduate School of Business and the Department of Mechanical Engineering. He is also founder and director of the Stanford Byers Center for Biodesign. He is internationally known for his work in inventing, developing, and testing new devices, including the rapid exchange stenting and balloon angioplasty system, which is now the primary system in the used worldwide. Which is now the primary system in use worldwide. He also invented the fundamental approach to intravascular ultrasound imaging and founded the Cardiovascular Imaging System, later acquired by Boston Scientific. He began his faculty career as an interventional cardiologist at the University of California, San Francisco, before moving to Stanford in 1994. Recent honors include the Catheter Therapeutics Career Achievement Award, the American College of Cardiology Distinguished Scientist Award, the National Academy of Engineering's 2018 Bernard Golden Prize for Innovation in Engineering and Technology Education. He holds more than 50 U.S. patents and has authored more than 300 peer-reviewed publications, chapters, and editorials, and 2 textbooks. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Yock to Ohio University.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I had a special fun meeting with some of the students this morning, had a nice dinner with the leadership last night. Pleasure to be here, and I want to particularly thank the Russ family for the endowment of this award and everything that they've done for engineering on this campus and really around the country. I wanted to start out, I should mention, I'll confess being bit by the entrepreneurial bug at a young age, but no conflicts of interest related to this talk specifically. So I wanted to start out by telling a little bit of a story around the technologies that evolved in my field of interventional cardiology. And I have 2 motives in mind. I'd like to weave together the contributions of some of my colleagues who you've heard of or will be hearing from later this week, But the second hidden agenda is to give you a flavor for the fact that these innovations all occurred when people were pretty early on in their careers, kind of at the stage that most of the people in the audience are. So I have Generation Z envy. You are at a stage in your lives where you're very creative and likely to come up with the next big thing. So listen to that flavor in this story. I'll start out with Dr. Fogarty, who, when he was in college, was a scrub tech in surgery, and he participated in a procedure to remove clot from the arteries of legs. And at the time, what the surgeons were doing were basically filleting open the entire artery, taking the clot out, and then sewing the artery back up. So you may not be surprised to hear that that didn't work so well. The arteries clotted again, and those patients almost all went on to amputation. And Dr. Fogarty, as a college student working in the OR, said, this is just not the right way to do this procedure. And he conceived of using a balloon catheter. His idea was, well, let's see, we're trying to take clot out of the artery, so why don't we just make a single incision at the top of the artery, run a catheter down with the balloon deflated through the clot, blow up the balloon, bring the clot out of the hole in the top, and then we have only that tiny little incision to fix up. So he thought it was a good idea. He went home, took a catheter, cut the pinky finger off of a surgical glove, tied it on with a fish line to the tip of the catheter, sterilized it, and the surgeons used it in the operating room, and it worked. And fast forward, that is the way that procedure is done. It was pivotal because it was the first time that a big surgical procedure had been converted to a minimally invasive procedure. And that became the paradigm for a lot of what you're going to hear about that we did in my field and other fields over the next decades. Excuse me. So Dr. Fogarty was aware of another problem. So besides clotting in arteries, as you know, you can build up blockages called plaques, and that's what causes heart attacks. And Dr. Fogarty was aware of the fact that maybe a balloon procedure could work for those plaques also, the buildup of cholesterol, of cheeseburgers in your arteries. The trouble was his balloon material was a silastic, and it was too flexible. It couldn't exert enough power to open up these blockages in the arteries, which are much harder than plaques. The blockages can have calcium in them. They're pretty stiff, pretty hard. So he was not successful. The person who did that successfully was Andreas Grünzig, a Swiss-German cardiologist. He grew up in Germany, couldn't get a job in Germany, and wound up in Zurich in Switzerland, which was a huge piece of good luck for him because in Zurich, there was an engineer who understood polymers really well, and he teamed up with that engineer, and they devised the first catheter and balloon that could work, that had enough oomph to open up the blockages in the coronary arteries. So he went on, and in his kitchen in Zurich, cooked the first balloon catheters that were ultimately brought into patient care. So the next picture brings us back to the Russ Prize. Dr. Simpson was out here last fall, and this is a picture of Dr. Simpson. Maybe he showed you this. A picture of Dr. Simpson as a young man. So here he's still in training in cardiology, not too much older than you all. And you can see the Grünzig's in the back. You can see he's experimenting with that other great therapy of cardiovascular disease, red wine. But Dr. Simpson is grinning in this picture because he has watched Dr. Grünzig do these procedures, and Dr. Simpson realized that the equipment Dr. Grünzig was using was terrible. And so Dr. Simpson came back to the US and basically designed a whole different kind of system. This is his prototype catheter, and his big insight was that you should because of the blockages in the coronaries are kind of hard to get to, you have to twist and turn to get down there, that you should go first with a guide wire that's easier to twist and turn, and then run the catheter over the top of that. That became the way to do angioplasty, and he and some friends co-founded one of the early angioplasty companies, and the industry was born, and now millions of patients are treated each year. So I was lucky enough to be in Dr. Simpson's neighborhood, and I was a trainee, and I started moonlighting in his practice. And one of the things that was striking was the fact that when we ballooned these arteries, they were coming back at an alarming rate, 30 or 40%. Now, if you had any other surgical procedure, if you were taking out gallbladders and they were growing back 40% of the time, you wouldn't think much of that procedure. We were trying to hide this number for a long time, but the truth was this re-narrowing or restenosis was happening way too often. This is a picture, so kind of confusing picture, but this is an angiogram. So we've injected dye into the coronary arteries. This is the heart here. These are the arteries on top of the heart. They should be this wide. This is a blockage, and this is a blockage that came back with this patient just a month after they had had the original balloon procedure. So as I was doing these cases in the early days, I had the instinct that this was kind of a fuzzygram. It was hard to see exactly what was going on inside, and I wondered if there wasn't a clue, if we could only get inside and get a better look at the artery, whether there wouldn't be a clue about what was going on with this re-narrowing process. And so I was familiar with ultrasound, which has the ability to look through tissues, as you know, and I thought, well, I wonder if we could develop an ultrasound technique for looking inside the arteries in higher resolution than the fuzzygrams that we were getting with the angiogram. So the idea was something like this, that if we could miniaturize the ultrasound transducer, put it in a catheter inside the artery, we would be able to see a cross-sectional slice of the blood vessel and see the buildup of the cheeseburger. So this is actually what an image looks like now. This is the hole where the blood is flowing. This dark stripe is the normal artery, and this is the buildup of the cheeseburgers. So this is kind of current level imaging, but we started out a little shakier than that. So this was the first generation scanner that we developed. And we worked on this for a couple of years to get the technology right. Dr. Fogarty, that first doctor I showed you, and Dr. Simpson both invested money and guidance into a company that we started up. And we got to this point where the catheters were working pretty well. We had animal testing, and it was time to think about doing human testing. And so this was my first time through this, and I sort of naively tried to call up the FDA and find out, what was the next step. You won't be surprised to hear that the answer wasn't terribly clear from the FDA, but I was getting the feeling that it would take, a year or more to get to clinical testing. So I had a buddy who I trained with who wound up going to Norway, cardiologist, and I talked to him about this. He was in Trondheim in the north of Norway, and I was complaining to him on the phone about how I didn't know what the next step would be to get to clinical testing. And he said, that's interesting, let me ask around here. So a week later, he called me up and he said, it's okay. And I said, what do you mean it's okay? He said, I talked to the guy in the government, and he said, sure, that sounds reasonable. Come on over and do it. So a couple weeks later, catheters in a suitcase, went over to Norway and did the first human studies over in Norway. You'll be forgiven if you can't interpret this picture. So I guess you can tell that there's something vaguely round here, which is an artery, but that was kind of as good as it got. And I brought these videos home to show to Dr. Fogarty, my esteemed mentor, and he looked at it, and he is quiet. Dr. Fogarty is a bit of a crusty character, and after a minute or two, he said, you know, I can't see bleep in those images. It looks like a hurricane off the coast of Miami to me. So with that motivation, went ahead and worked harder on the project. And in fact, we did wind up sorting out this question that launched the whole episode, which is what was going on that was making these arteries come back. We thought, and the prevailing wisdom was that there was a buildup of the inner lining of the blood vessel, kind of a scarring that would go on. It turned out once we could look inside the arteries, it was something much weirder, which is that the whole artery was shrinking down. We were doing enough injury to the deep wall of the artery that the whole thing was shrinking back down. So I'm going to pause here and ask you, if you knew this in 1990, what would you do? What would you design to overcome this shrinkage problem? Any thoughts? I hear whispering. How would you prevent an artery from shrinking down? Bingo, prop it open, right? So this is what we do now. We put little scaffolds inside the artery that prop the artery open so that it can't do this shrinkage. And some of you who heard Dr. Palmaz, who has the tie on in the center, know that he invented the first balloon expandable stent, which turned out to be the way that everybody does it. And to his left, Dr. Schatz is, who will be up here later in the week, a vastly entertaining guy, by the way. So you should come and hear him. He's got a great sense of humor. He'll tell a great story. So this was the first example of a stent, and this is really where the technology, with the stents have gotten better, and we now put drugs in them and so on. But this is kind of the mini history of the development of my field. In each of these cases, Dr. Palmaz invented the stent just after he was coming out of his training. And my point is, you all have a unique advantage when you're freshly entering your fields to see things in a creative way. It's a great time for you to take a risk and really go with some of your ideas, because some of your wacky ideas are going to be right and are going to be important. So I'll shift gears and thinking back about sort of my career and how lucky I was to be exposed to Dr. Fogarty, Dr. Simpson, and in my case, the happenstance of having these great mentors. I started wondering when I came to Stanford, and we have great engineering resources like you do here, great medical resources, whether there wasn't a possibility to do something inside the university to help train innovators in the med tech space. So all of my experience, all of the mentoring that I valued in terms of innovation technology transfer was outside of the university. And it felt like there could be a program inside the university that at least some students would benefit from. So colleagues and I got together and said, okay, let's try to do this. And we need a core philosophy for doing this. And this was what we decided on as a core philosophy. A lot of innovation, as you know, especially at universities, is what you could call technology-initiated, technology-push innovation. Come up with a great discovery in the laboratory. It's a really important technology, but let's figure out where we can use that technology. That's a great way of innovating. Marvelous platform innovations come from that kind of process. But our point was that there's a mirror image of this process, which is need-pull innovation. That, especially in our field of biomedicine, we have the ability to look deeply into the needs first and then invent a technology based on that understanding. This is a version of classic design thinking, and you've probably seen this paradigm. This is the one from IDEO, which is one of the great design companies. And the key point about the process is that you don't start out with inventing or ideating. That's the middle part of the process. First, you understand your client, your user, define what their needs are. It's called user-centered design. Very powerful methodology, right? And I know that there's good design training at the university here. We have a particular problem in healthcare in implementing design thinking, however, and that is our user is a complicated beast. It would be great if we could just design for patients or for the patient-provider interface, but we have this mess of other stakeholders. So hospitals that buy the technology or insurance companies that pay for the technology, a regulator that is really meticulous about what technologies it can go for, the press that watches us carefully as they should because we're dealing with human lives and risks. To make things even more complicated, the priorities of all of these stakeholders changed with Obamacare. And they're in the process of changing again in a way that nobody really understands. It's a very dynamic target. What all of this means is that in healthcare, we need a very meticulous process that starts out with a focus on needs before you get to inventing. And so this process that we call the Biodesign Process starts with needs finding and need screening. It's a process a number of folks from engineering, business, and medicine put together over the years, starting with our first fellowship director, Josh. And I love his quote, which is, "A well-characterized need is the DNA of a great invention." So what I would like to do is walk you through the process that we use, that we teach, and the best example of this is a postdoctoral fellowship that we do, where we recruit engineers and physicians who are through their training and put them together in multidisciplinary teams of 4. So this team from a few years ago had a surgeon, a mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, and a chemical engineer. So they show up on campus in August, and we announce to them which area of medicine we're going to send them into. So this year we're doing ear, nose, and throat. It's different every year. And we say to this team, go live in the hospital for at least a couple months, and don't come back until you have at least 200 observations of needs that, if you could come up with a technical solution, would be important. And so they go off, they go on rounds, they go in the hospital, talk to patients, bring back 200 needs. There's a little bit of psychology at play here. So all inventors, and especially young inventors, fall in love with needs too easily. So anytime you see a medical need, it's kind of by definition important because somebody's suffering from that and you would like to fix it for them. The trouble in our field is that in order to get a new technology approved by the FDA and tested and into patients, it takes years, and it takes typically tens of millions of dollars. So you want to be very careful about which need you pick. And the process that we use is intended to slow people down in the needs phase to allow them time to do real diligence on the needs finding. So we use a couple of tricks to do that. We ask the teams for each need to come up with what we call a need statement. And the need statement has this format. It's one sentence that says, I'm going to look at a way to solve what's the specific problem in a certain population that I understand very well. Not all patients, it's for this need. Who exactly is the population that I'm going to do it for? And then most important, what is the outcome that I want to achieve? Let me emphasize again, nothing has been invented before. And in fact, if the teams say, you know, I think we know a way to do this, we ask them to put it aside and just focus on the need. Don't let the invention creep in. We just want you talking about the need. So here's a device that came out from some of our students a few years ago. It's called the Zeo patch. It's a convenient patch for recording rhythm disturbances. If you know, some of you probably have had parents who've had atrial fibrillation or grandparents. That's one example of a rhythm disturbance. So the idea is, in order to diagnose that rapidly, your internist can have this patch, can just put it on you when you come in, and it reads your rhythm, goes up to the cloud, analyzes it, and so on. So that was the invention. But back before there was an invention, this is the need statement that this team came up with. So again, it starts a better way to detect potential rhythm disturbances. Okay, what's the population? Well, they said, we want non-hospitalized patients with suspected arrhythmias. And you notice this is pithy. There's a lot in this. So they decided that they wanted to solve this for patients outside of the hospital. That's an important decision point right there. And then what's the outcome going to be? We're going to improve the patient experience and reduce cost of diagnosis. So this becomes a contract with the team for when they invent later. They're going to read it back against these criteria and make sure that they're meeting all of it. If their invention doesn't meet it, scrap the invention. So I already mentioned that one of the psychological things going on here is you want to not get to the need too quickly. You want to diligence it. And the way to do that, we think, is to have a lot of needs competing. That's why we do the 200. And then we filter the 200. And it's easier, even if you're a little bit in love with a need, if there's another one that by these criteria is a little better, you can let go of that one and go with the one that has better criteria. And speaking of criteria, to flesh out the need statement, we have a deeper layer of specificity, which is to give us 3 to 4 criteria that your invention must have to be successful, and 3 or 4 that you'd like it to have. So for this product, they said, well, we wanted to have the must-haves are minimal impact on lifestyle, has to be accurate in determining whether what the patient is experiencing is caused by arrhythmia, has to monitor longer than a week, has to cost less than $500. So those are specific contractual obligations the team has to prevent the second episode of falling in love that is a risk, which is you come up with a cool invention and you really want that invention to go forward. You're not going to let it go forward unless it meets these criteria. So it's a way of truth-telling that you make sure that you get the need right. We'll skip over the nice haves, not that important. So, all right, at this point, with the needs finding, needs filtering, we're 5 months into our process. We devote 5 months of the year just to needs, no inventions. Now it's time to invent. I like what this team said. Given enough time, sugar, and caffeine, you will invent something. We basically give our fellows a guarantee that if you get the need right, you will invent something that is successful. And that's turned out to be pretty reliably true. Here's the Zeo patch, the initial brainstorms. But here too, we use a little bit of design thinking. We say, don't just come up with one solution, one idea. Give us at least 2 or 3 for each of the needs that you're taking forward, and then have those compete with each other. So if there are 3 needs that they've input, they have a couple 3 solutions to each. Now we filter again. Same idea, don't fall in love with your invention. Use objective criteria to sort out which one is going to go forward. And here, like I've said before, use your must-haves and nice-to-haves as your first screen. That's your contract to pick which invention you're going to go forward with. And then you bring another set of filters up, which are traditional. Just if you're in the business, they're traditional. So IP stands for intellectual property, the patent landscape. Regulatory is FDA. Reimbursement is does Medicare pay for this kind of thing already, or do you have to get a new coding? And then what's the technical feasibility? So after all of that, if your idea survives those filters, you have a good idea, pretty much guaranteed. Now, I wanted to give you an example of an inadequate use of this process, a bad example. So, and it's a bad example on me. So this was the first thing that I tried to do when I was in training as an intern. And like a lot of interns, sometimes I had trouble getting blood, putting the needle into the vein. And so I thought about that, got frustrated by it, and decided, well, wait a minute, there's a way to do this. Here, let's just put a Doppler transducer at the tip of the needle. And as the engineers in the audience know, Doppler detects velocity, it detects blood flow, and you can actually make the system so that it plays the sound of the blood flow out. So if you put the needle on the skin and you're pointing to a vein, you'd hear a like that. If you're pointing to an artery, you'd hear a like that. And so I thought this is a great way to land the needle in the vein like you're landing an airplane. Bingo, let's go, formed a company around it. Well, the good news about this idea was that it took me to the very peak of my publishing career early on with an article in the National Enquirer. My patent attorney called me up one day and he said, "Did you know that you're in the National Enquirer?" And I said, "No, how did you know that?" He didn't have a good answer for why he was reading the National Enquirer, but so I immediately went down to the 7-Eleven on the corner, and it was true. There was an article in there. And so I grabbed a stack of these things and brought them to the counter, and the guy at the counter gave me the strangest look for me. And for some reason, I decided to say to him, "It's okay, I'm in it." And then he got really scared, right? And he reached for the red button under the counter. The trouble was I didn't go through this process. So I had a vague idea about the need, which I have to say is similar to what I see lots of us doing. We think we understand the need. And if you had asked me how to do this, I would have said at the time, okay, what I'm trying to do is localize arteries and veins to improve the speed and accuracy of needle sticks. And that sounds pretty plausible as a need statement, right? And I would have said, sorry, that my need criteria, well, has to be fast, has to be accurate. I can't have the needle size be bigger. And of course, it needs to maintain sterility. So, I had a pretty good understanding of the need, I thought, enough to launch a company and have lots of people working on this and spend lots of money. So it turns out I missed two things that any of you could have caught if you spent maybe 2 hours thinking through this process and doing a little bit of research. So the first thing I missed was that the existing approach was cheap. So pennies, right, to get this equipment. Why is that important? It's important because I got the population wrong. For most patients, it's not worth the expense of all of these electronics. Nobody's going to pay. These needles came out costing about $18 a piece. Nobody's going to pay for that, except if the stakes are really high. In the high-risk patients, trauma, acute myocardial infarction, heart attacks, and so on. So what we did, not thinking of this, we launched this company with a huge sales force and broad sales distribution. And it took us 2 years to figure out, wait a minute, we're not selling to primary care physicians or nurses and so on. The only place where it's going is here. Wasted a huge amount of time and money with that. I missed the second thing. So in order for this to be used widely, it has to be easy to use, relatively easy to use, fast to learn how to use it. And it turned out as we rolled out the technology, the arteries and the veins didn't sound all that different. The arteries were and the veins were more pulsatile than I knew, and they were kind of like that. Not too much different if you're a new user. So we could have, if we had known this early on, there's the engineers in the audience will know that there's, in the Doppler signal, there's an encoding of what direction the signal is. And so we could have on the box said artery or vein through the encoding from the signal. The trouble is, by the time we figured this out, we were 2 years down and millions of dollars into the design and manufacturing. Manufacturing was all locked in. We didn't have the money to go back and change this. And what we did instead was we made a bunch of videos of me going whoosh, whoosh, or whoosh, whoosh, which didn't work. So 2 big mistakes. If I had done the process properly, I would have realized with not much work that it has to be cost effective, it has to be user friendly, and in that limited population, then the price point would have been okay, but we couldn't have this thing with videos going on, just not acceptable. Bottom line is getting the need right at the beginning is everything. It provides a basis for everything that you're going to do subsequently. So just a little bit more, because although the fundamentals of this process that I've talked to you about are robust, I think, we're making some changes that I want to make you aware of. But the fundamental process works pretty well. We're convinced now that the final stage is implementation, figuring out the business plan, and so on. If you get the need right, the invention will be right. If you get those 2 right, the implementation is going to happen. And I present as evidence the fact that so these fellows of ours that come in are first timers. They start at 0. In fact, they don't know what medical area they're going into. So they start even behind 0. But the process works. Every year we have a couple companies that come out from the first timers. These are the companies that have come out so far. We're over 50 now. And more important than that, we're starting to reach large numbers of patients. So we tally up at graduation each year. Last year we were at 2.7 million patients. This is just from the inventions that have come within the program. And then the nice thing is that our product is the alums. And they go on and do this again. So there are another 40 companies that these folks have started after leaving the program. And they are sticking with this process of getting the need right. So I said there were some things, though, that we're tweaking. And I'll leave you with the 2 most important ones. And that is, I mentioned to you that we send our fellows off into the hospital to do their needs finding. And we've been doing that for the past 19 years. Well, the trouble is looking for important needs in the hospital is kind of like looking for your keys under the lamppost. Health needs span an entire spectrum, starting with health and prevention, something we were talking about last night, that this is a fantastic area for folks here to go out into the communities and understand what it is that optimizes health, that provides for preventions. Some of that will be technology enabled, right? With communication, digital communications for health. You're in a great area to needs find there. Early diagnosis, the hospital's a thin sliver of the health experience. And then discharge and rehab, of course. And happily, our students are way ahead of this, so a number of our companies that have come out actually are on this spectrum, even though we've been starting them out just in the hospital. So we're trying to reform our process and make sure that folks are looking outside of the hospital, going home with patients, being in the communities, and so on. The second thing, and this is maybe even more important, so typically, for the last 50 years in health technology innovation, once you got to the implementation side, you'd figured out the intellectual property and so on, then you developed a value proposition, which was the way that the economics were going to be sold. So as everybody in the room knows, we are in the middle of an economic crisis in healthcare. We're headed to $4 trillion of healthcare expenditures. 17, 18% of GDP. New technology is one of the big contributors to healthcare cost escalation. So we have a responsibility as inventors of technologies not to leave the value proposition to the end, but to start at the beginning exploring opportunities for value. Just as important to look for where are the areas where we can save money in healthcare as it is to look for ways of improving healthcare. They have to go hand in hand now. So what we're doing is developing a set of what we call signposts to help guide our innovators in directions to look for where they can find value. Some of these are pretty self-evident. So, excuse me, if you can shorten the length of a hospital stay, change to a less expensive place, like move to the clinic instead of being in the hospital, lower the number of staff, reduce procedure time, shift intervention to a lower cost provider. So if you can take a specialist procedure and have a generalist be able to do it, better yet, generalist procedure and have a nurse provider do it, or best of all, if it can be done at home by the patient and the family, those are powerful cost-saving examples. In fact, the Zeo patch that I mentioned is a good example of this. Before the Zeo patch, what was happening is that a patient with rhythm problems would see their internist, who would almost always refer to a cardiologist because this could be a life-threatening problem, who would almost always refer to a subspecialist to get that technique done. So the problem was that there's a ka-ching at each of those points. And most patients don't have a dangerous arrhythmia. Only 5% of patients who present to the internist have something that is worth getting a specialist involved with. So the Zeo patch allowed that whole process to be short-circuited, and a nice study recently showed that it saved about $600 per year per atrial fibrillation patient. So I'll wind up with one more example. There's another set of signposts that we call budget-based signposts, and this is where you look at more at the economics. So where across the country there are outliers in cost effectiveness, where it's unprofitable. Here's a big one, conditions where the long-term costs are really high. Like if you're going to have to take a medicine for blood pressure or for diabetes for the rest of your life, that's really expensive. So that's a good place to look to try to bend the cost curve for healthcare. Or here's another, interventions where the technology itself is a high percentage of the cost. So take a guess for me. So you know what ventilators are like, right? In the intensive care unit, you have a big machine, connects to the endotracheal tube, the breathing tube. Take a guess for me, just a rough guess at how much those ventilators cost the hospital. Any ideas? Anybody brave? There's not a really wrong answer here, so just holler out some numbers. What do you think? Okay, 10's a good guess. It's more than that. So yeah, 40 to 80, that's about the range that ventilators cost. So Matt Callahan and his team said, you know what, this is legacy technology, this is decades old. We have on the shelf chip components that can do almost all of what these clunky ventilators do. And so they just started from scratch and said, our goal is to create an affordable ventilator with off-the-shelf components. So their ventilator is $900 cost of goods. The startup is in India because that's where a great low-cost market is going to be. But our federal government has put a bunch of money into that company because if we have a bird flu or a corona surge in this company, when we have a bad flu in this country, we almost max out the number of ventilators in intensive care in the country. If we have something that's twice as bad, people are going to be dying. A large number of people are going to be dying for lack of ventilators. So the government is highly interested in stockpiling a ventilator like this. This is a small example, sorry, last slide, of something that's going on that is, I think, really healthy. And that is a virtuous cycle for innovation between the developing world and the U.S. We have been in the U.S. Unconstrained largely from the standpoint of cost in terms of developing our technologies. Not true in the developing world. They have a culture, a sensibility, and a skill set about developing affordable technologies that we simply haven't had. And there's a lovely thing happening as we globalize our educational systems and our cooperations within companies of leaning on that sensibility in the development world for creating affordable technologies that we need here. So that's my story. Thank you for your attention. Happy to take any questions or hear your comments.
Any questions from the audience?
So I was wondering, it's brilliant talk, thank you for that. I was wondering, when you have that pool system where you identify a need and try to find a technology, and you develop suppose 10 out of which one is actually giving an answer to the need. Is there anyone who looks at the remaining 9 ideas and thinks that this can fit another need better?
Yeah, so the question is, when we go through this process, we're throwing away some pretty good needs that might be exploited. We do keep a registry of those, and we actually feed those needs into different classes. So we do try to recycle.
Right.
Way in the back.
I have a corollary to that question. What do you do with cool ideas that everybody looks at and says, my God, that is cool, but it doesn't fit the need? Do you throw those away, sticking to your principle?
Yeah.
What do you violate your principle and start looking for a need for the cool idea?
Yeah. So there are times, I have to admit, where the cool idea is kind of irresistible and tends to start to creep in. We really try to be disciplined about that, and we have some years created burial ceremonies where we reward the team and celebrate the fact that they're making the brave decision to cut something off. There's a program, we have some international partnerships, and there's a program in Galway, Ireland, and I envy them because they're in a 17th century place, and they have a dungeon actually in their room where they can throw bad ideas. I think the symbolism of that is really nice. So.
More questions?
It's a great talk. I really enjoyed it. It's very good for the students to hear this, and for me as well.
Thank you.
The one question I had, your examples seem to be mostly on the device side. Do you have any examples that came out of this process that were therapeutics? Yeah,
so it's a great question, and the answer is no. So we decided early on that we were going to focus on devices because of our skill set, and because I do think the innovation process is a little bit different on the therapeutic, on the pharma biologics side than it is on the device side. And I would say that especially now with the advances in the biologic side, where it's a little more similar to devices than it was 20 years ago, where there are components out there that you can draw on to assemble. So I think now is a good time to try to do the same process on that side of things, just we haven't.
Sorry for not asking another very profound question. I'm curious, what happened to your smart needle company?
Yeah, so the intellectual property got sold to another company at a discouraging transaction, and but the new company has focused on those patients, especially neonatal ICU, where it's used reasonably widely. Sure.
Basically, some of our students may go down the path to be an entrepreneur down the road. So we know there's a word in the entrepreneur world called Valley of Death. So what kind of suggestion will you give to our students?
Yeah.
Who want to go down this path?
So the question is, there's a valley of death after your invention to getting it to patient care, to commercialization. I think my number one solution would be to find a mentor, do everything you can to find somebody who's done this before, hopefully a number of times before, to advise you. It really can be tough, and that makes a huge difference.
Thank you so much. Oh, Joe.
So in the entrepreneurial community writ large, there tends to be a startling lack of diversity in terms of people who self-identify and move forward as entrepreneurs, in terms of mostly being white males.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what your experience is in terms of attracting participants from a more diverse background and then having them go through and succeed in the process.
Yeah. So the question is, in tech innovation in general, certainly out in Silicon Valley, there's a preponderance of white males. So what's the experience of trying to get more diversity in? This is something that has become a top priority for us over the last few years, both from a gender standpoint and from a racial standpoint. The numbers, so in biomedical engineering, you may know that there's a really good proportion of women going into the field. That's the good news. Later on, if you look at companies, there's a very steep pyramid. So we are working with a couple of the national organizations to actually get accurate statistics about this and create some programs focused on women entrepreneurs. And in our program ourselves, we try to get 50% of women at least. That's our first focus. The story on racial diversity is worse. And in our field, especially African Americans, are tremendously underrepresented. So we're trying to do the same thing. We have reworked all of our materials. You may have noticed even in my presentation, we are very careful to show in every public face that we can examples of racial as well as gender diversity. So just the short story is, we have a huge amount of work. We're starting from a discouraging position, but in healthcare, we should pay attention to diversity even more than the other technical domains, because we're trying to develop technologies for those patients. The diversity is a huge part of our customer base. And with respect to gender diversity, 70% of healthcare decisions are made by women. So come on, let's get some women involved in creating the technologies.
That's right. And actually, NIH, the experiment, they request should be half. It should be kind of like female and male.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Please join me to thank our speaker again.
Thank you.